Welcome to the History Maps podcast. You are looking at a society that has just had two-thirds of its entire population practically erased.
Yeah, literally ripped from their homes.
Right. Marched across these punishing mountain ranges and then completely deported into the heart of a foreign empire, all while hundreds of thousands more are just killed outright.
And it wasn't just the people. I mean, the capital city is reduced to ash. The ancient vineyards are totally burned.
Exactly. And yet the survivors, the ones who managed to hide up in the high mountain gorges, they don't submit. They don't just give up.
No, they basically wait. They organize themselves up there.
Yeah, and decades later, they launch this coordinated, highly asymmetric strike, and it is so devastating that it completely breaks the colonization plans of, one of the most powerful empires on Earth.
Which is just a massive historical pivot.
It really is. So today, as part of our Caucasian history series, we are examining the Kingdom of Kakheti.
Right, a realm over in eastern Georgia.
Yes, anchored in this incredibly fertile valley, walled in by mountains that somehow navigated centuries of shifting empires.
It's a very long, very intense timeline.
Totally. And the mission for you, the listener, as we go through these historical sources today, is to dissect exactly how this specific region maintained its identity.
Right, from its early days as a principality in the 8th century.
Through its peak as a fully independent kingdom, all the way down to its eventual annexations by the 19th century. Okay, let's unpack this. Because none of this history makes sense until we look at the ground they were standing on.
Yeah, the geography is basically the absolute foundation of everything that happens to Kakheti. I mean, if you look at a map, Kakheti is situated right in the Alaverdi Valley.
Which is highly fertile.
Incredibly fertile. It's an alluvial plain, heavily fed by rivers coming right off the slopes, but it is completely walled in by these incredibly rugged, high mountain borders.
So you have this real duality going on.
Exactly. You have the rich, totally vulnerable valley floor on one hand, and then the inaccessible, easily defensible mountains on the other. And that created a very unique societal structure.
Right, because you get the immense wealth of agriculture, but combined with the defensive redoubt of the highlands.
Yeah.
And looking at the sources, that agricultural wealth was definitely not some recent development. I mean, viticulture, the cultivation of grapes for wine, traces back in this specific valley to 6000 BCE.
Which is basically the dawn of agriculture.
Yeah. We're talking deep antiquity, and the sources highlight their traditional fermentation method using something called a kevri. Let us explain what that is, because it is definitely not just a normal wooden barrel.
Oh, no, far from it. A kevri is this enormous egg-shaped clay vessel.
Like, how big are we talking?
Massive. These are not small pots. I mean, some of them can hold hundreds of liters of wine. And the key to the whole Kakhetian method is that these massive clay vessels are literally buried deep underground to age the wine.
Under the dirt.
Right, exactly. The earth regulates the temperature naturally. So that allows the wine to ferment and mature over, months or even years.
So mechanically, you were talking about burying your actual wealth.
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it.
You are anchoring your entire agricultural output into the soil itself, which points to a deeply rooted, very sedentary population. I mean, a society that buries its wine in the earth is a society that intends to stay exactly where it is.
Right. It is a physical manifestation of permanence.
Yes, permanence.
And the people who were actually tending those vines were primarily indigenous Kartvelian-speaking groups.
The Kartvelian language family being completely distinct from its neighbors. Right.
Totally distinct. It is not Indo-European. It's not Turkic. It is completely indigenous to the Caucasus.
Yeah.
So these were the Proto-Kakhetians. But, the demographic fabric wasn't strictly confined to just the valley farmers.
Right, because you have those mountains.
Exactly. The sources specifically mention mountain tribes, like the Zanars. Now, initially, the Zanars inhabited the much higher altitudes, up in the really harsh passes.
But they don't stay up there entirely.
No, over time, they intermingled with the lowland populations. And this created a society that was both agricultural and highly martial.
So they had the economic engine of the valley.
Right.
But the very defensive, hardened mindset of the mountains.
Yeah, they really needed both to survive what was coming.
And they needed that hardened mindset very early on, I mean, right out of the gate. Because by the mid-8th century, the region is just thrust violently under Arab rule.
Yeah, you see the Umayyad Caliphate and later the Abbasid Caliphate really exerting control over the area.
And it wasn't peaceful. Between 722 and 737, there's a commander named Marwan ibn Muhammad who led some really devastating expeditions through the region.
Right. And Marwan's goal was not just to plant a flag and leave.
Mm.
It was to enforce absolute submission and really heavy tribute from the locals.
The sources are pretty clear that his campaigns were brutal.
Very brutal. The whole strategy was to essentially break the local power structures. They wanted to integrate the wealth of the Caucasus into the broader caliphate.
And they had specific mechanisms for that economic extraction, right? The taxes?
Exactly. They imposed two main taxes on the population, the jizya and the kharaj.
Okay, let's break those down. Because a tax in the 8th century is not just, a line item on a paycheck.
No, it is a systematic, heavy drain on a region's entire pool of resources.
So what was the jizya?
Well, the jizya was a poll tax, basically a per capita tax levied specifically on non-Muslim subjects living within the Islamic Empire.
So it was essentially the price paid for protection and the right to practice their own religion.
Exactly. And then the kharaj, on the other hand, was a land tax. And that one was based entirely on the agricultural output.
Ah, okay. So going back to that highly fertile Alazani Valley we just talked about.
Right, all those vineyards.
The Kharaj meant that a huge, significant portion of the wealth generated by those farms was being siphoned directly out of the region.
Yeah, packed up and sent straight to Damascus or Baghdad.
It's an immense burden. I mean, you are paying a tax simply for existing as a Christian, and then another heavy tax on literally everything you grow.
It really was.
Yeah.
But the sources do point out a critical shift a bit later on.
Right, the transition of power, the Umayyad Caliphate falls, the Abbasids take over, and the political center of gravity shifts over to Baghdad.
Yeah.
How exactly does that transition affect a distant province like Kakheti?
Well, it essentially creates an opening for them.
Yeah.
The transition significantly weakened central control.
Because the empire was just too big.
Exactly. The Abbasids were dealing with this massive, wildly overextended empire. So the heavy burden of those taxes, combined with a very distracted central authority, pushed the local Georgian rulers, who were known as Aristavis, or dukes, to actively rebel.
Which brings us to a really pivotal figure in the sources, Prince Archil of Kakheti, who ruled from 736 to 786.
Right, Archil is crucial here. He recognized a really fundamental strategic truth about his situation.
Which was?
That you simply cannot resist a massive empire through mere skirmishes. You have to build a totally independent economic base first.
Right, because if your entire economy is geared toward paying the Kharaj to Baghdad, you have absolutely no surplus to fund your own army.
Exactly.
So what does Archil actually do on the ground?
He completely reorganizes the local economy. He prioritizes local agricultural exploitation, making sure they're keeping the wealth right there within the valley.
So he stopped sending it out.
Right. He uses it to sustain his own forces rather than relying on any sort of patronage or approval from the caliphate. And then he takes that retained wealth and uses it to build defensive strongholds all across the region.
He is effectively creating a self-sustaining infrastructure of resistance.
That's exactly what it was, a closed loop of defense and economy.
But that resistance came at a really severe personal cost for him. I mean, the sources note Archil was eventually captured by Arab forces.
Yeah, and he was executed specifically for refusing to convert to Islam.
Right. Yet the structural work he did actually survived him. He laid the foundation for the next phase of Kakheti's political evolution.
He did, because by the late 8th century, a figure named Grigol seizes control. And Grigol establishes a governing system centered around a very specific title called the Chorepiscopus.
I want to look closely at this title, actually, because it is highly unique. A chorepiscopus. To put it in modern terms, it sounds almost like a mayor who also serves as the highest local religious leader.
Yeah, that's a really solid analogy.
Like completely consolidating civic, military, and spiritual authority into a single position.
That is an accurate way to look at it. It is a complete fusion of church and state, right there at the local, regional level.
But my question is about the sustainability of a system like that. I mean, when you put all your societal eggs in one single basket, isn't that incredibly fragile?
It seems like it, yeah.
Because if the chorepiscopus is killed in battle, you haven't just lost your general, you've lost your high priest.
It is a massive risk, certainly. But you really have to view it in the context of the 8th and 9th centuries. It was actually a highly effective mechanism for sheer survival.
How so?
You have to consider the adversary they were facing. They were fighting a caliphate that heavily justified its expansion through religious doctrine.
Right, the jihad element.
Exactly. So to effectively counter that, Uniting your own civic and religious leadership creates a highly cohesive ideological resistance. The core episcopus unified the spiritual resolve of the people directly with the physical defense of the realm.
Okay, I see. It simplified the command structure completely.
Yes, when the leader spoke, it carried both administrative weight and divine mandate.
Mm.
There was no questioning it.
So it was just a necessary centralization of power for a state that was under constant, unending siege.
Exactly. And this early principality, built on that dual authority, really laid the necessary groundwork for a much more secular, formalized power structure later on.
Right. It leads directly to the formal establishment of an actual kingdom.
Yeah, and that transition happens definitively in 1014. A ruler named Kviriki III formally declares himself king of Kakheti and Hereti.
And he immediately gets to work on the administration of the realm. He makes the city of Telavi his capital, and he divides the realm into 7 specific duchies.
The Sarastavos, right?
Right. The sources list them as Rustavi, Kafetari, Pankizi, Shtori, Vagini, Kornabuji, and Machi.
That level of really specific administrative division implies a state that is definitely moving past mere survival, right? It's moving into complex governance.
Oh, absolutely. Kvirike III was actively standardizing the administration to maximize resource extraction and also military mobilization.
By dividing the land into these specific duchies.
Yeah, because then he could hold individual local lords totally accountable for raising troops and collecting taxes in their specific zones.
It makes everything modular and trackable.
Exactly. However, the political history of the Caucasus is highly cyclical.
Very much so.
This independent Kakhetian kingdom was actually later absorbed into a much larger unified Georgian realm for a while. But unified states in this specific region rarely lasted very long.
No, they didn't. So following the eventual collapse of that unified state, the Kingdom of Kakheti formally emerges again as an independent entity in 1465.
And this time it's under the Kakhetian branch of the Bagrationi dynasty.
Right.
And the geopolitical map they inherited in the late 15th century was vastly different from the days of the Arab caliphates we were just talking about.
Entirely different.
They are now wedged directly between emerging massive gunpowder empires. You have the Ottoman Empire to the west and the various Persian dynasties, soon to be the Safavids, to the south and east.
It was a very dangerous neighborhood.
Extremely. So we look at King Alexander I, who reigned from 1476 to 1511, and his approach was intensely diplomatic.
It had to be.
The sources show him sending really lavish gifts to the Akkoy Yunlu leader Uzun Hasan in 1477.
Let's define the Akkoy Yunlu, actually, because they were a major power player in the region.
Yeah, who were they?
The name translates to the white sheep Turkomans. They were this vast, highly militarized tribal confederation. At that time, they controlled much of modern-day Iran, Iraq, and eastern Anatolia.
So they were an immediate, truly existential threat sitting right on Kakheti's southern border.
Yes. So Alexander I sends them tribute just to keep them at bay.
But he doesn't stop there. The sources note he sends embassies far to the north, too, to Ivan III of Moscow in 1483 and then again in 1491.
Right. He is actively trying to balance these massive regional powers against one another.
Which is smart.
Alexander I understood the geographic reality. Kakheti was trapped. They could not win a prolonged war of attrition against these giant empires. Diplomacy was basically his primary weapon.
He needed the Russians to threaten the northern borders of his enemies.
Exactly. Forcing those enemies to keep their main armies away from the Caucasus just to deal with the Russian threat.
But wait, how does diplomacy actually work in this era? I mean, you cannot just send a polite letter to a massive empire and just, ask them not to invade.
No, definitely not.
Diplomacy requires massive funding. You have to send gold, you have to send silk, you have to send tangible wealth to keep these empires satisfied. Where does a small mountain kingdom get that kind of capital?
And that brings us perfectly to the economic engine of this era, which was systematically developed by King Levin, who reigned from 1520 to 1574.
Okay, what did he do?
Levin understood that local agriculture alone would not pay the diplomatic bills forever. So in 1565, he founded the city of Gremy.
Which became his capital?
It became the royal capital, but much more importantly, he positioned it as a bustling Silk Road trading town.
But how does a city stuck in a mountain valley become a Silk Road hub? I mean, the main trade routes usually follow the path of least resistance across the flatlands, right?
Traders do follow the path of least resistance, yeah, but they also highly prioritize the path of highest security. And the primary routes across the plains of Anatolia and Persia were frequently being turned into literal war zones by the Ottomans and the Safavids.
So it was too dangerous to trade down there.
Right. So King Levan offered a detour. He offered a totally stable, secure route straight through Kakheti. The merchants had to navigate much tougher mountain terrain, sure, but they would not be plundered by marching imperial armies.
That is a brilliant pivot.
Yeah, in Gremy, Kakhetian wine and locally produced silk were heavily exchanged for Persian and Ottoman goods. Gremy basically became this cosmopolitan financial center, just full of caravanserais and merchants from all across Eurasia.
And the kingdom taxed that movement.
Heavily. They charged tolls, they taxed the trade, and that provided the hard currency necessary to pay off their neighbors.
You literally leverage the wars of your neighbors to make your own territory a safe haven for their trade, and then you use the profits to buy your own security from them.
It's an incredible strategy.
It really is. But unfortunately, all that wealth and diplomatic maneuvering could not prevent internal tragedy.
No, the internal politics were vicious.
Very. Alexander I, the king who masterminded that early diplomatic balance, was actually murdered in 1511.
And it was a coup orchestrated by his own son.
Yeah, George II. The sources note that George II not only killed his father, he also blinded his own brother, Demetrius, just to completely remove him as a rival to the throne.
The practice of blinding a political rival was actually quite common in Byzantine and regional politics.
Why blinding specifically?
Well, a blind man could not lead an army in the field, and therefore traditionally he could not hold the throne. It was a brutal way of neutralizing a threat without incurring the specific religious stain of fratricide.
Even though the violence is incredibly obvious.
Very obvious, but it highlights the severe internal fragility of these monarchies. I mean, you can fortify your borders all you want, but if the succession is highly contested, the state can easily collapse from within.
And looking externally, even with all the wealth of Gremy pouring in, there are serious questions in the sources about their actual military capability to defend those borders if it came to a real fight.
Right.
A Russian ambassador named Zvenigorodski visited Kakheti in 1589, and he made very specific notes on their military strength.
What did he find?
He observed that King Alexander II could assemble 10,000 men and 500 trained musketeers.
Okay, well, 10,000 cavalrymen and 500 musketeers is actually a fairly formidable regional force for the time.
For a localized conflict, sure.
Yeah, for suppressing a local peasant rebellion or fighting off a raid from a neighboring mountain tribe, it is more than sufficient.
But considering the era, how does that really hold up? I mean, how could a kingdom relying so heavily on traditional cavalry levies hope to defend its trade wealth against the massive, modernized armies of the Safavid or Ottoman empires?
Yeah, armies fielding tens of thousands of men.
Exactly. Professional soldiers equipped with cannons and standardized firearms?
The blunt answer is that they largely couldn't, not in a pitched open field battle.
Right.
If Kakheti's army met a Safavid imperial army on a flat plain, they would be utterly destroyed. The military was simply not designed to stop an empire in a conventional war.
So what was their doctrine?
Their military doctrine was based purely on border skirmishes, controlling the tight choke points of their trade routes, and just utilizing the harsh terrain.
To understand how they actually managed their society and their defense on a day-to-day level, we need to look at their internal structures.
Right, the feudal system.
Kakheti operated on a very decentralized feudal hierarchy. The kingdom was divided into the Serestavos, which were the duchies we mentioned earlier.
And those were ruled by the Erestabis, governors.
Yes. And beneath them were the Tavati, the feudal princes, who directly managed the peasant obligations. It is a highly stratified system.
It was highly stratified out of absolute necessity. The king sitting in Talavi or Gremy did not have a massive standing professional army ready to deploy.
He had to call on the lords.
Exactly. He depended entirely on those local Aristaves and Tavati to muster their own cavalry and collect their own taxes when called upon.
So the central authority was actually relatively weak compared to the local lords.
Yes.
And the justice system really reflects this decentralized local focus as well. The sources describe a legal system that blended orthodox canon law with customary law.
Right, local traditions.
And a major component of that customary law was weregild. Let's explain how weregild actually functions, because it is essentially a mathematical formula for violence.
It is. Weregild literally translates to blood money.
Right.
In a society where honor is paramount and a central police force literally does not exist, A murder or an injury can easily spark a blood feud between two families that lasts for generations.
Just endless cycles of retaliation.
Exactly. So Weir Guild is a system designed specifically to avert that endless cycle. It assigns a specific, negotiable monetary value to a person's life, or even down to specific body parts.
So if someone from one family kills a member of another,
The offending family must pay a set amount of wealth, be it cattle, silver, or land, directly to the victim's family to settle the debt.
it's highly transactional.
It was a very practical, highly codified system. It was designed to maintain societal order without requiring a massive centralized bureaucracy to enforce the laws.
It is a way of containing the damage locally.
Right.
And militarily, they applied that exact same logic of containment. They utilized the terrain to contain threats.
Yeah, the defense relied on those cavalry forces you mentioned, but heavily on strategic fortresses like Ujarma.
Which was positioned heavily on the Iori River Gorge.
Yes, they didn't build fortresses to hold long, static lines. They built them to strictly control movement.
You don't meet a Safavid army on an open field.
Exactly. You let them march into the narrow gorges, and then you use fortresses like Ujarma as anchors to launch quick ambushes and bleed their supply lines dry.
You just make the cost of occupation higher than the value of the plunder.
That's the entire goal.
But beyond the military and the feudal administration, there was a profound cultural pillar that unified the kingdom. A very real physical anchor for their identity.
The Alaverdi Cathedral.
Yes, the Alaverdi Cathedral. The sources indicate it stood as the kingdom's absolute heart.
It was magnificent.
Originally founded as a small monastery back in the 6th century, it was Kvirek III who expanded it into a grand cathedral in the early 11th century. And the architecture described here is staggering.
It really is. It is a massive structure, reaching nearly 50 meters high.
Which is huge for the era.
It is one of the tallest religious structures in the entire Caucasus, and it was built in a triconch style.
What does triconch mean functionally?
A triconch essentially means the floor plan is shaped like a three-leaf clover.
Okay.
You have three semicircular apses radiating outward from a central dome, and that creates a massively open interior space.
And the exterior was built of cobblestone,
Right.
but covered entirely in yellowish tuff.
Yes, tuff. Tuff is a type of rock made from compacted volcanic ash.
Why use that specific?
Well, it is relatively easy to carve when it's fresh, but it hardens significantly over time. And crucially, it is somewhat porous and flexible.
Oh, which helps with earthquakes.
Exactly. It makes it highly resistant to the frequent earthquakes in the region.
And it was originally topped with brilliant blue glazed tiles,
Yeah.
which must have looked striking against the green of the valley and the snow of the mountains.
Absolutely stunning.
The sources also detail how the tribute system of Kakheti evolved around this time. We talked about the early Arab taxes, the jizya and kharaj.
Right.
But by the time of the Safavids, the system shifted to what the Persians called pishkesh.
Kashish.
Pishkesh was characterized basically as annual gifts of silk, wine, and specie. Specie just meaning hard currency like silver and gold coins.
And that shift from structured taxation to pishkesh is highly significant.
How so? It's still paying the empire, right?
It is, but pishkesh was technically framed as a voluntary gift from a subordinate ruler directly to a suzerain. It wasn't an administrative tax collected by imperial bureaucrats crawling all over your land.
Oh, I see.
This allowed the Kakhetian kings to collect the wealth themselves. It channeled local wealth into maintaining their own royal courts and border garrisons, and then they only sent a specific portion down to the Safavid capital to maintain diplomatic peace.
So it was a highly subtle way of maintaining internal sovereignty while projecting external submission.
Exactly. What's fascinating here is how the physical architecture of the Alaverdi Cathedral perfectly mirrors this geopolitical posture.
How do you mean?
Well, if you look at the exterior of Alaverdi, despite its towering height, it is highly austere. It is sparse. There are very few external carvings or grand displays of wealth.
It looks tough.
Right. It was designed to withstand earthquakes, yes, but also to survive repeated brutal invasions. It projects this hardened resilience.
But the inside is different.
Completely. The interior was grandiose. It was culturally rich, thoroughly illuminated by natural light, and covered in intricate frescoes.
So the building itself is a metaphor.
It really physically manifested the Kakhetian survival strategy. Austere, unyielding, and hardened on the outside to survive the empires, but fiercely preserving their cultural and religious illumination on the inside.
That is a very powerful way to look at it, but the reality of their geopolitical situation was about to completely shatter that equilibrium.
Unfortunately, yes.
Because despite the strong fortresses, the deep gorges, the immense wealth of Gremi, and those strong cultural anchors, the mid-16th century brought an adversary that walls and austerity simply could not stop.
No. We move into the era of the initial Safavid invasions under Shah Abbas I.
Right. Between 1540 and 1553, Shah Abbas I launched a series of 4 highly destructive campaigns directly into the Georgian kingdoms of Kartli and Kakheti.
And the motivations for these campaigns were definitely multifaceted.
It wasn't just simple conquest.
No. First, Tahmasp actually wanted to diminish the power of the Ustajlu tribe.
Who were they?
They were a specific Qizilbash faction that held way too much influence in the border regions. He needed to reassert central authority over his own military commanders by keeping them busy and bleeding their forces a bit.
Ah, internal politics.
Exactly. Second, he was seeking massive plunder. The Safavid army required constant, massive influxes of wealth to remain loyal.
And Grimi is sitting right there.
Right. And third, he officially declared the campaigns as a jihad against the Christian populations.
Which provides the ideological justification for total war.
Yes.
And the results described in the sources were immediate and just devastating. The neighboring kingdom of Kartli really took the brunt of the initial strike.
Right.
The city of Tbilisi was heavily plundered.
And King Orsab I of Kartli refused to submit.
Right. He was forced to flee into hiding up in the high mountains, just waging a desperate guerrilla war.
But over in Kakheti, King Levon, the same king who founded the trade hub of Gremi, he looked at the military disparity and made a very different calculation.
What did he do?
Levon realized that his 10,000 cavalrymen simply could not hold back the Safavid tide. He chose to submit.
He just gave up.
He traveled to the Shah's camp and formally pledged allegiance. He agreed to pay the Peshkesh and acknowledge Safavid's suzerainty.
Which, I suppose, worked in the short term. His submission actually spared the physical infrastructure of Kakheti. Gremi was not burned, the vineyards were not uprooted.
Right, the building survived.
Yeah.
But the demographic impact of these raids across the broader region was still profound.
Yeah, let's talk about that. The sources indicate that in a single march, 30,000 captives were taken by the Safavid forces from the Caucasus.
30,000.
Now, how does a medieval army physically deport 30,000 people at once? That is a logistical nightmare.
It is a horrific, brutal process. These were forced marches across very brutal terrain. Captives were tied together, driven forward by cavalry. The supply lines of the era could barely feed the actual soldiers, let alone tens of thousands of prisoners.
So the attrition rate.
Starvation and exposure took a massive, massive toll on the journey. But you have to understand, this was not just random, chaotic plunder.
It wasn't.
No, it was a highly deliberate extraction of human capital.
Where were they taking them exactly and why?
They were taken back to mainland Iran. The Safavids were implementing a system known as the Gilman system.
The Gilman system? What is that?
They needed administrators, soldiers, and artisans who were entirely 100% dependent on the Shah, rather than being loyal to the various tribal factions within Iran.
I see.
The Georgian captives, being Christian outsiders, were stripped of their prior allegiances, forcibly converted, and then integrated directly into the Safavid bureaucracy.
Into the state apparatus itself.
Yes, into the royal harem and into the elite military guard.
So they're creating a loyalist class from scratch.
Exactly. This policy fundamentally altered the demographic makeup of both the Caucasus region, which obviously lost an entire generation of its youth, and the Safavid court itself.
Because suddenly you have this powerful new elite class of Georgian origin operating deep within the Persian Empire.
Right.
The human cost of that extraction is just horrific to contemplate. The sources mention the specific, very tragic fate of Luarsab I's mother, Nestan Derjan.
Yeah, that is a dark story.
She was taken captive by Safavid forces, and rather than face that deportation, the forced conversion, and the integration into the Shah's harem or court, she committed suicide.
It really underscores the profound terror these campaigns inflicted on the general population.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though, geopolitically. After all this devastation, the 1555 Treaty of Amasya formally ends the broader wars between the Ottomans and the Safavids.
Right, they settle their borders.
And in that treaty, they carve up the Caucasus. Kakheti is firmly legally placed in the Safavid sphere of influence.
But the local rulers?
Exactly. Despite Lavon's submission, they still tried to operate with a significant degree of independence.
Yeah, they submitted on paper, but they maneuvered constantly in practice.
How so?
Well, the Kakhetian kings, like Alexander II, who ruled a bit later, they paid the tribute. They sent the silk and the specie, but secretly they sent envoys north to Russia.
Behind the Shah's back?
Completely. They were constantly looking for a counterweight. They were trying to entice the czars to exert pressure on the Safavid borders up north, hoping to create enough distraction to allow Kakheti some real breathing room.
That is an incredibly dangerous high-wire balancing act.
Very dangerous.
And that exact balancing act sets the stage for one of the most catastrophic conflicts in the region's entire history.
Yes, it does.
We move into the early 17th century during the reign of Shah Abbas I, and the situation just deteriorates rapidly. In 1605, King Alexander II is murdered in a sudden coup.
And the assassin is his own son.
Yeah, Constantine I.
Now, Constantine had actually been raised at the Safavid court as a hostage.
Under the Gilman system.
Exactly. He had converted to Islam, and he was deliberately sent back to Kakheti with an Iranian army specifically to assassinate his father.
Because his father was seen as too independent.
Right, he was too close to Russia. The goal was for Constantine to take the throne as a totally loyal Safavid puppet.
But the Kakhetian population absolutely refused to accept this. I mean, a patricide orchestrated by a foreign power was just a bridge too far for them.
They revolted violently.
They overthrew and killed Constantine.
And Shah Abbas, who was dealing with other massive wars at the time and could not commit his full imperial army to suppress the rebellion right then, reluctantly recognized Teimuraz I, who was the grandson of Alexander, as the new king.
He backed down.
Temporarily. Shah Abbas accepted the situation for the moment, but he was a ruler who never, ever forgot a slight. He fully recognized that Kakheti was actively hostile.
And Teimuraz I, for his part, was deeply suspicious of Safavid intentions. I mean, knowing that Abbas had just orchestrated the murder of his grandfather.
Oh, absolutely. The trust was zero.
So the tensions finally erupted into the open just a few years later. In 1612, Teimuraz executes a faction of pro-Iranian nobility directly within his own realm.
He was cleaning house, getting rid of the spies.
Right. And then in 1613, Shah Abbas officially summoned Teimuraz to join a royal hunting expedition down in Mazandaran.
Which is a trap. I mean, a summons to a royal hunt from the Shah is not an invitation, it is a direct command.
But Teimuraz flatly refused to go.
He knew the history of his family. He calculated, quite reasonably, that if he went to the Shah's camp, he would be imprisoned, blinded, or just assassinated on the spot.
And that refusal was the final diplomatic breach. Shah Abbas stopped maneuvering and launched massive systematic invasions into Kakheti between 1614 and 1617.
And the destruction described in the sources here is just total.
It really is. It wasn't a military campaign aimed at changing the government. It was an erasure of the entire society.
Shah Abbas implemented a strict scorched earth policy. The goal was to permanently remove Kakheti as a political entity and a potential staging ground for Russian or Ottoman influence.
So what happens to Gremi?
Gremi, the prosperous Silk Road capital founded by King Lavon, the city that had funded their survival for decades. It was completely razed to the ground.
Just gone.
Every caravanserai, every market, every palace was burned. It was destroyed so thoroughly that it literally never regained its prosperity. It forced the survivors to eventually move the capital back to Tel Aviv.
The physical destruction of the infrastructure was absolute, but the demographic toll is almost incomprehensible.
It is grim.
Let's look at the actual figures provided in the historical sources carefully. The estimates state that between 100,000 and 500,000 Georgians were killed outright during these specific campaigns.
In a span of just a few years.
Right. Furthermore, between 130,000 and 200,000 people were forcibly deported to mainland Iran.
The same deportation strategy as before, but scaled way up.
The sources conclude that this effectively removed 2/3 of Kakheti's entire population.
2/3. The scale of the violence is truly staggering. To execute a demographic shift of that absolute magnitude requires a systematic, organized military effort focused entirely on rounding up civilians, burning the crops to induce starvation, and just marching the survivors south.
Why empty the land completely?
Shah Abbas wanted to remove the rebellious element entirely, once and for all, and at the same time utilize the highly skilled Georgian agriculturalists and artisans to develop barren, uncultivated regions within Iran's own borders.
So what does this all mean? I want to pause on that figure. 2/3 of the population gone. How does a society even function when two-thirds of its people are simply erased from the map?
It doesn't.
Right. I mean, who tends the vines? Who mans the fortresses? Who bakes the bread? The entire economic and social fabric is effectively dismantled. The fields would go to rot.
The towns would be silent. The society simply ceases to function as a state. It reverts to bare survival in the wilderness.
The political structures collapse because there is no one left to govern and absolutely no wealth left to tax.
Exactly.
Even when King Teimuraz I managed a brief, desperate military victory at the Battle of Sitsamari in 1615, it didn't really turn the tide, did it?
Not at all. In fact, it only provoked a heavier, far more punitive response from the Shah the following year.
It just made him angrier.
The Battle of Sitsamari proved to Shah Abbas that the Kakhetians still had the will to fight, which only heavily reinforced his decision to eradicate them completely.
So he intensifies the deportations.
He did. He also took key royal hostages to finally break the morale of the leadership. He took Teimuraz's mother, Queen Ketevan, and Teimuraz's own children. They were taken to Shiraz in Iran.
And the sources note they were ultimately killed. Queen Ketevan was tortured and martyred specifically for refusing to convert to Islam.
An event that deeply, deeply scarred the Georgian psyche.
It is a level of devastation that goes way beyond conquest. It is the deliberate breaking of a kingdom.
It was absolutely intended to break them permanently. But the historical record shows that even in the face of this near-total annihilation, the survivors in Kakheti did not entirely submit.
Right, the ones who hid.
Those who escaped the deportations fled into the high mountains. They lived in the deep gorges, reverting to a much harsher, highly decentralized existence.
And in those mountains, they harbored a deep, simmering resentment.
Oh yes, they watched their valley from the heights. And that resentment would lead to a massive boiling point just a few decades later.
Which brings us to the 1650s. Teimuraz is now an aging king in exile over in western Georgia, and the Safavids are now looking at a largely depopulated Kakheti.
The valley is practically empty.
So the Safavid administration decides to implement a massive repopulation policy of their own. They plan to settle 80,000 Qizilbash Turkoman tribes, known as the Els, directly into the Alazani Valley.
Let's define the Qizilbash again, just to be clear.
Yeah, who are they?
The term literally means redheads, referring to their distinctive headgear. They were a massive coalition of nomadic Turkic warrior tribes that basically formed the elite military backbone of the Safavid Empire.
So they aren't just moving peasant farmers into the valley?
No, the Safavid administration had very distinct strategic goals for moving 80,000 of them into Kakheti. They are moving a military caste.
What were the goals?
First, repopulating the fertile valleys with fiercely loyal subjects ensured that agricultural production would finally resume, generating tax revenue for the empire again.
Right, get the farms working.
Second, they needed a fierce martial population to secure the area against Lesgian marauders. The Lesgians were constantly launching devastating raids down from neighboring Dagestan.
Because the empty valley was just a massive security vacuum.
Exactly. And third, the Safavids were becoming increasingly wary of Russian pressure, slowly moving south toward the Caucasus. A massive, loyal Turkoman buffer population sitting right on the northern frontier served their geopolitical interests perfectly.
So to solidify this colonization, the Turkomans began building heavy military infrastructure. They constructed a massive new fortress at Bagrationi.
And they did something else, something highly provocative, something designed specifically to break the spirit of the remaining Georgians.
Right. They took the ancient Alaverdi Cathedral, the 50-meter-high cultural heart of Kakheti, the building with the austere outside and the illuminated inside, and they converted it into another military fortification.
Converting Alaverdi was a direct, highly calculated strike at the identity of the survivors. It signaled that the cultural and religious history of the valley was over. The land now belonged to the empire.
But pushing a desperate people too far has consequences.
It always does.
The uprising, however, wasn't just a spontaneous reaction to this grand strategy. The sources indicate it was sparked by two very specific localized outrages.
Yes. It was triggered by the forced evictions of the very few remaining local Georgian populations from their ancestral lands just to make way for the Qizilbash herds. And the final spark was the immense outrage following the rape of an Orthodox priest by Qizilbash forces.
That was the absolute catalyst.
The desecration of the priest and the theft of the land.
It ignited a fury that completely overcame the historical divisions among the Georgians. That spark united factions that rarely, if ever, worked together.
Who came together?
You had the lowland nobility, the remnants of the old feudal system we talked about, figures like Zal, the Duke of Aragvi, Bidzina Chilakashvili, and Shalva, the Duke of Kisani. They had the tactical knowledge and the remaining wealth.
But they needed manpower.
And they found it in the mountains. They aligned with the fierce Highlander tribes, the Tushs, the Kamsurians, and the Chavs, led by warlords like Zezvik Umprandali.
So the alliance between the lowland nobility and the Highland warriors formed this devastating unified front. The Highlanders brought a ferocity and a real expertise in asymmetric, rugged warfare that the Qizilbash, who were accustomed to fighting as cavalry on wide-open plains, were completely unprepared for in the narrow confines of the valley.
In September 1659, this combined Georgian force launched a highly coordinated, massive strike against the Turkmen settlements.
They didn't just skirmish, they attacked the main strongholds directly.
Right. They hit the fortress at Bagrationi, and they simultaneously assaulted the fortified Alaverdi Cathedral.
It was a true masterclass in asymmetric warfare. They heavily used the element of surprise, striking at night or directly from the heavy forests.
The sources state that the Georgian forces exterminated thousands of the Turkoman settlers in a very short period and essentially drove the remaining population entirely out of the region in a massive panic.
The Qizilbash were completely routed. It was a swift, brutal, and absolute reclamation of their own land.
But the leaders of the uprising, Zal, Bidzina, and Shalva, were definitely not naive. They knew exactly what they had just done.
Oh, they knew. They had just slaughtered the elite tribe of the Safavid Empire.
Right. They knew how the Safavid court would respond to that. They all vividly remembered the demographic catastrophe under Shah Abbas.
Exactly. They knew a massive imperial army would inevitably march north to burn whatever was left and kill whoever survived.
They understood the geopolitical mathematics of the situation perfectly. So to avert a retaliatory campaign of total annihilation from the Shah upon the general population, these noble leaders took an extraordinary, almost unthinkable step.
Right. Zal was actually assassinated shortly after the revolt due to internal politics, but Bidzina, Shalva, and another noble named Elizbar, they voluntarily traveled to the Safavid court and surrendered themselves.
They literally walked right into the lion's den.
They did. They offered their own lives to satisfy the Shah's demand for blood and justice.
They took the sole responsibility for the uprising completely upon themselves, explicitly to shield the peasantry and the Highlanders from retribution.
And they were handed over to the surviving Qizilbash tribesmen and suffered horrific martyrs' deaths.
That is a profound level of calculated sacrifice. To orchestrate a massive military victory and then immediately surrender your own life to secure the political outcome of that victory.
It is a profound sacrifice, and crucially, from a strategic standpoint, it actually worked.
It did.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the uprising, combined with the execution of the ringleaders, completely changed the calculus in Isfahan. The Persians realized that the region was simply too hostile, the population too volatile, and the mountains too impenetrable for mass civilian settlement.
It just wasn't worth the blood.
Exactly. They abandoned the colonization plans entirely. Kakheti officially remained under Persian rule on paper, and a puppet king was installed in 1664 just to maintain the fiction of control. But the physical threat of complete demographic replacement was halted forever.
The valley remained Georgian.
It did.
But while the immediate physical threat of colonization was stopped, the constant, unrelenting pressure from the south over the centuries fundamentally altered the mindset of the Georgian leadership.
They were traumatized.
Right. They knew they could not survive another Shah Abbas. They could not survive another mass deportation. And that trauma ultimately pushed Kakheti directly into the arms of a new, rising northern power.
By the mid-18th century, the entire political landscape shifts dramatically. The Safavid Empire finally collapses, replaced eventually by the Qajar dynasty.
And in 1762, Kakheti and the neighboring Kingdom of Kartli were formally merged into a single, unified state under the Kakhetian Bagrationi king, Erekle II.
Erekle II is a really fascinating figure. He was a brilliant military commander, but he recognized the writing on the wall.
His newly unified kingdom, though temporarily strong, could not indefinitely survive the dual grinding pressures of a resurgent Persia and the Ottoman Empire.
The mathematics of population and resources simply didn't favor him at all. He needed an ally with massive military infrastructure. He needed a Christian empire.
And he found one in Catherine the Great's Russian Empire.
Russia was aggressively expanding southward at the time, seeking a foothold in the Caucasus, specifically to push back the Ottomans and Persians.
So their interests temporarily aligned perfectly.
Perfectly. So on July 24th, 1783, King Ercole II signs the Treaty of Georgesque.
The terms of this treaty are really stark. It fundamentally rewrites the sovereignty of the kingdom.
It does. On one hand, Russia formally becomes the sole suzerain of Kartli Kakheti.
And in return, the Russian Empire formally promises to protect the territorial integrity of the kingdom against any external enemies, and officially guarantees that the Bagrationi dynasty will continue to rule indefinitely.
But the concessions that Ercole made to secure that military guarantee were severe.
What did he give up?
By signing the treaty, Kakheti completely lost its independent foreign policy. They were legally forbidden from communicating or negotiating with Persia, the Ottomans, or any other nation without explicit Russian consent.
So their main diplomatic survival mechanism, the very tool Alexander I used centuries earlier, was surrendered entirely.
Yes. Furthermore, their spiritual independence was heavily curtailed. The Georgian Orthodox Patriarch was officially downgraded to a mere archbishop subordinate directly to the Russian Orthodox Church.
And to enforce this treaty, and theoretically provide the promised protection, 2 Russian infantry battalions were permanently stationed within the kingdom.
Right.
Looking at the reality of this treaty, was King Ercole II forced into a fatal geopolitical trap? Or was it a calculated gamble that simply backfired on him?
It was a calculated gamble, but it was based on a complete lack of better options. Ercole saw the massive Persian armies reforming down to the south. He knew he couldn't fight them alone forever. He traded a degree of his sovereignty for physical survival.
But the tragedy is that the gamble failed disastrously.
Because the guarantor of the Russian Empire did not uphold their end of the bargain when the existential threat actually arrived.
Right. The protection promised by the treaty proved to be completely illusory. In 1795, the new ruler of Persia, Aga Muhammad Khan Qajar, marched a massive army toward the Caucasus.
And he sent an ultimatum to Ercole II.
He demanded that Ercole renounce the Russian treaty, break the alliance, and submit fully to Persian suzerainty or face total destruction.
But Ercole refused. He really believed in the treaty. He believed the Russian battalions would reinforce him.
But the Russian forces had been withdrawn due to other geopolitical priorities, right?
Yes, and reinforcements were not sent in time. So Aga Muhammad Khan invaded with a massive force. At the Battle of Kutsanisi, the Georgian forces, fighting desperately and just vastly outnumbered, were completely routed.
The Persian army marched directly into Tbilisi. The city was sacked, burned to the ground, and thousands more were massacred or enslaved.
The Russian military support that Ercole basically traded his sovereignty for simply never materialized when it mattered.
The aftermath of Kutsanisi left the kingdom physically shattered and politically desperate. Ercole's successor, King Georgi XII, inherited a burning realm.
He was desperate to save the physical integrity of his kingdom and ensure his family kept the throne, even just as figureheads.
So he offered a massive compromise to the court in St. Petersburg. He basically offered complete submission to Russian laws.
He agreed to effectively integrate the kingdom fully into the Russian Empire's legal and administrative structure, provided that the Bagrationi family could remain as autonomous royal heads of state.
It was an offer to become a vassal state in the truest sense.
It was. But the political calculus in St. Petersburg had changed completely. The Russian Empire, now under Tsar Paul I and soon Alexander I, rejected the compromise outright.
An autonomous kingdom with its own royal family sitting on the volatile southern border just did not fit into their autocratic, centralized imperial model.
So in 1801, Russia unilaterally annexed the Kingdom of Kartli Kakheti.
They completely dissolved the Bagrationi monarchy, removed the royal family from power, and turned the ancient kingdom into a standard Russian governorate administered by appointed generals.
It is a stunning betrayal of the original treaty.
And the local population definitely did not accept this quietly. The sources detail a rapid, highly violent deterioration of relations.
The people quickly realized they had just traded the Persian threat for Russian domination.
By 1810, a 10,000-strong Persian army, accompanied by a deposed Georgian prince, Alexander Batonishvili, actually attempted an invasion to exploit all this unrest.
And they were defeated by Marquis Philip Paolucci.
Right, Paolucci is an interesting figure, a Russian general-governor who had formerly served in the French army.
Paolucci held the line against the Persians, but the internal situation within Kakheti itself was just boiling over. Widespread, highly localized revolts erupted against the heavy-handed Russian administration and their military requisitions.
The Kakhetian peasants in the region of Akhmet rose in active rebellion.
In Tianeti, a Russian officer who was accused of outraging a Georgian woman was literally cut to pieces by the furious locals. The resistance was visceral and immediate.
The violence spread incredibly rapidly. The Russian military garrison at Sinagi was completely wiped out by insurgents. Tel Aviv, the former royal capital, was blockaded.
The populace was fighting a brutal guerrilla war against the very empire that was supposed to protect them.
And over time, the violent rural uprisings evolved into organized, elite political plotting.
Yes, the sources describe a highly significant event known as the 1830 Patriotic Plot.
That was the goal there.
Members of the deposed royal family, Okrepir Bagration and Prince Dmitry, formed a secret society right in Tbilisi. They organized with prominent Georgian noble families, such as the Orbiliani and the Aristavi.
And their explicit aim was to orchestrate a widespread rebellion to overthrow Russian imperial rule and reestablish the independent Bagrationi kingdom.
The mechanics of the plot show a very deep desire to actively reclaim their stolen sovereignty.
Ultimately, the plot was discovered before it could launch, right?
Yes. The conspirators were arrested and exiled to very remote parts of the Russian Empire.
But the sheer existence of the plot, involving the highest levels of the surviving nobility 30 years after the annexation, it demonstrates that the desire for independence had not been extinguished by a simple stroke of a pen in St. Petersburg.
It demonstrates that you can annex a territory, you can change the administrative borders on a map, and you can exile all the leaders, but you cannot easily overwrite the historical identity of a population that has spent literally 1,000 years defining itself against foreign empires.
It is a remarkable story of endurance. We are looking at a kingdom that fought off the Arab caliphates, built a massive economic engine in the mountains, survived the catastrophic demographic erasure of the Safavids, launched impossible asymmetric rebellions, only to be absorbed and ultimately betrayed by the ally they sought for protection.
Which brings us to a final thought for you to mull over as we conclude.
Yes.
The cultural resilience of the mountain people and the Kakhetian lowlanders didn't just end with political annexation. It actually inspired generations long after the kingdom fell. It fueled a massive cultural and literary revival in the 19th century.
Through literature.
Exactly. For example, it heavily inspired epic literature, like Vaza Shavela's 1892 poem Bagrationi, which vividly immortalized the 1659 uprising we discussed.
It kept the memory alive.
That poetry served to keep the memory of their autonomy alive when the physical reality of it was completely gone. It suggests a profound historical truth. While treaties are signed and broken, while empires expand and collapse, and political borders are drawn and erased by the sword, the fundamental identity forged in the valleys and mountains of Kakheti proved impossible to fully annex or deport.
It really leaves us with a lingering question. How does a nation preserve its inner sovereignty, its very soul, when it completely loses its political maps? Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.